Well, welcome to the Senior Concerns Legal Seminar Series. I am very excited to introduce our speaker today, who's going to be talking about everything you need to know if you're hiring in-home care privately. This is such an important topic, and anyone who's caring for a loved one really needs to hear what she has to say today. So I'll be introducing Renee Noy. She is a partner at WorkWise Law. She earned her BA summa cum laude from the University of Colorado at Boulder and received her JD from the University of California, Hastings College of Law in San Francisco. In the last decade, Renee has represented countless employees in employment discrimination lawsuits. With a deep understanding of the specific pitfalls that employers often make that lead them into the courthouse, Renee now helps employers minimize their legal risk with expert knowledge, instructive training, and preventative action. Renee prides herself in ensuring that the legal requirements and processes are followed so that outcomes are fair and productive for both the employee and employers. Her ultimate goal is to help employers prevent making costly mistakes. Renee worked with me last year on creating a little one-pager with some of the key points from her presentation today. So I will also email that around to everybody who registered following this presentation, along with a link to view the recording. So thank you so much for being here today with us. And I will let you take it away, Renee.
Thank you so much, Martha. And thank you everyone for being here. Like Martha said, I did this presentation. I can't believe it's been a year, but it was about a year ago. And so I was telling her before we got on here that not so much has changed in the last year. So it's gonna be a very similar presentation if you already heard this, but I'm happy to do it again. I think it's always good to be reminded of how to do things properly and in compliance, especially with something as important as your family members and the elderly community. So my name is Renee, and I was a plaintiff's lawyer. I want to give you a tiny bit of background of who you're listening to for the next hour. As a plaintiff's lawyer for 13 years, I was representing employees suing companies for discrimination and harassment cases for years. And then when I decided I wanted to go out on my own and start my own law firm, I was going to open a plaintiff's firm because that's kind of all I knew. But then after thinking about it, I'm like, I have sued so many companies and I was suing very, very large companies like Amazon and Walmart and Universal Studios and just massive companies. And they were messing up things that they had in-house counsel for, they had human resource departments. So I'm like, if they're messing it up, how is a small and a medium-sized company that doesn't have those resources, how are they supposed to know what to do? So that was the whole premise of our firm. And it's all about compliance and making sure that people don't get sued, that companies don't get sued, and that everything is done fairly. So I started this firm a little over 6 years ago, almost 6.5 years ago now, which is shocking, and it's been great. So then I was just having companies call us, and we are doing all sorts of different litigation and compliance work for companies, when all of a sudden one of my friends, an attorney who has since passed away, unfortunately, he called me and said, listen, I have a friend from college, and his wife is dealing with her elderly parents, and she's had these caregivers in her house, and it was a family of Filipino caregivers, the mom, the sister, the uncle, the cousin. I mean, truly a family. And they have different shifts of when they work. And now the parents need medical assistance, so they can't be in their home anymore. So now that that's taking place, now they're getting sued, and it's a labor commissioner hearing. So it's not a civil litigation hearing; it goes through the labor commissioner, which deals with wage and hour, which we'll talk about. He's like, "Can you help?" And I thought about it. I'm like, "Well, that's interesting because I definitely understand the labor commissioner process, and I've defended claims in there, but this is more of an individual basis, and I really hadn't dealt with that before." But when I thought about it, I'm like, it's not really that far off from what I do. So yeah, let me try it. So I had this really wonderful woman come into my office. She's, probably in her 50s and having just a lot of struggles dealing with her parents who are now in their, 90s, and going into a medical facility, leaving the home that she grew up in, that she was in for, they lived in for, I think, maybe 60 years, something, huge. And it was very emotional. So she comes into my office with literally butcher paper. This woman was extraordinarily organized, and she unrolled the butcher paper on my conference room table, and it was just like Excel spreadsheets, but handwritten. It was a little chaotic, but it was all what she did was she was very meticulous about checking everybody's shifts and when they were working, and then everyone there was overlap. There were single shifts. Everyone was overnight. They needed 24-hour care, or 24-hour supervision, and she had a regular rate of pay, which I believe was about $20 an hour. And then she created her own premium pay, which didn't have any legal significance. It was just her own name for it, at like $25 an hour. And I'm kind of making these numbers up, but it was right around there. I just can't remember exactly. And she had these calculations. She paid them, regularly. I think once a week. They all got their checks. There were no missed payments whatsoever. And what happened is that, and this is now I found out after being extraordinarily educated in this topic, there are Filipino representatives, and it may be for other communities too. For some reason, the Filipino community has a very large caregiving population, where there are a lot of caregivers in that community. And so because of that, you have these representatives that are being hired by law firms, the plaintiffs firms that are out there to sue people, to sue companies. And they go to the churches where there's a big Filipino presence, and they say, are you a caregiver? You have rights. And most likely your employer is not paying you properly, and you need to call this number. And they are getting the phone calls, and they are getting a ton of cases this way. So I sat there with this woman for months, just like unraveling these numbers. And I started educating myself very quickly on the rules. And I kept thinking there has got to be some sort of protection for the elderly population. There is no way that the rules apply in the exact same way for somebody that we're talking about in their 90s, as I always use this example, but as the CEO of Target. There has to be some statutory protection for elderly people. And I started really going into the archives of Google to figure out what the laws were. And as it turns out, there's been so many proposals by legislatures I'm only speaking about California, and I should give a caveat that this entire presentation is only focusing on California. And as I told Martha, who just disclosed about her parents, thank goodness her parents don't live in California, because the rules are much more onerous and burdensome when you live in California. So having said that, I found out that there's been a lot of proposals by legislatures, by state senators, House representatives, trying to get some sort of buffer in place to protect the elderly population from exactly this situation. None of them have passed, which is extraordinarily unfortunate. And so because of this, we put this together. I told her, your premium pay, that's a beautiful concept, but that's not legal. It's not legally compliant, because overtime is not $5 more than your regular rate, it's time and a half. So had she done it properly, you're talking about, if it's $20 an hour, you're talking about $30 an hour, right? Time and a half, for all of the extra hours beyond 9 hours, which I'll also talk about in a few minutes, because it's not the typical over 8 hours that's the one saving grace in all of this caregiver conversation, is that there's this one law called the California Domestic Bill of Rights, which we'll get into. So cut to, we go to the labor commissioner office, and it's this woman there, this daughter, this loving daughter, who just wants to give her parents some sort of help and protection in their last chapters of their life. And she wheels her father. Her mother was too sick to even show up. She wheels her father into the labor commissioner office in a wheelchair. He was very, very elderly, but very, very sharp. So he really did understand what was going on. And we sat there and we argued it. And this ended up being, they were trying to get, it was hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, not an exaggeration. It was literally in the six figures. And because when you're talking about years, and you're talking about missed overtime and wage statements that are improper, there's penalties in the labor commissioner that attach to it, and it becomes an extraordinary number. So we end up negotiating it. We negotiated a lot, and I'm sitting there as their lawyer negotiating against a representative of a law firm who's not an attorney. She has, I don't know what her legal background was, but she definitely was not, she was not on top of this. She did not understand the rules at all. And so, we sat in front of the commissioner, argued it, and it ended up getting significantly decreased. But if I remember properly, I think it was like a $50,000 or $60,000 settlement. It was something still really, really large, which was coming from their, money that they were trying to leave for their great grandchildren. So it was a very quick education on what these rules are and how awful it can be for the elderly. And so that's when I became passionate. And so whenever I talk about my work as doing caregiving work, I always call it my passion project, because 90% of my practice is working with corporations. I have no problem billing corporations for my time. This is what they do. It's part of their legal budget, that everybody knows it's the cost of doing business, dealing with legal expenses in the state of California in particular. When I'm dealing with elderly families, it kills me. And I want to help. I all of my grandparents have passed away, but that's what I picture when I'm talking to these families, is just them just trying to leave a legacy. They've worked for years and years, their entire lives, to be at the end of their life, and to be able to then be in their home and have caregivers. That's a luxury. That's an incredible, incredible luxury, as opposed to being in assisted living, which there's some beautiful facilities out there. I'm not knocking assisted living facilities, but I can certainly tell you that living in your own home that you've lived in for 50, 60 years, that is a luxury. So this is why I'm passionate about what I do. That's why when Martha reaches out to me and wants me to help out, I want to educate, because the problem is that people don't know. And you have these beautiful families, these beautiful children that just want to take care of their parents after their parents have taken care of them all these years, and they don't know what they're doing. They've never run a business, or more likely they do run businesses. They just don't realize that the laws are exactly the same, and so you have to be really, really on top of everything. So let's just talk about what you need to know. This is the bare bones. This is what you need to know if you're not going into an agency. And we'll talk about agencies towards the end of this seminar. But right now, if you're like, okay, this is great. I have my parents. They're going to need caregivers. What do I do? So wage and hour rules in California, and wage and hour are just, there's a wage and hour order, and the wage and hour order is you have to pay overtime, you have to have minimum wage, meal breaks, rest breaks. There's all of these rules. And if anyone goes into any, I don't care what company you're talking about, you go into any company in the state of California, you will find mistakes. It could be the most sophisticated company. And that's why these plaintiffs lawyers are just, killing it right now, is because that's been this big, big thing, is like, let's find wage and hour violations. And I have a lot of wage and hour claims in my office right now that I'm defending. And it's really hard. I always say, look, it's a formula. You're talking to me about harassment, discrimination. I can argue till I'm blue in the face about why you did not discriminate, why there was no harassment. That's easy. Wage and hour rules, you either followed it or you didn't follow it. So having said that, this California domestic, it's called the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. So this is the one thing that you should probably write down, because it's easily Googleable. There's nothing magical about this Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, but it's something that you really need to understand. So thank goodness there's a couple positive shining bright lights to my talk, and it's limited because this is a very tough topic, but I'm a pretty optimistic person, but this is definitely not easy. So if you have a personal attendant, that is somebody who spends over, I have my notes in front of me just because I want to make sure I get this right. It's someone who spends more than 20%, I'm sorry, there's a domestic worker, and then there's a personal attendant. Just think about a personal attendant as somebody who's doing the caregiving for your parents, your family, whoever it is. They're spending most of their time, 80% of their time, feeding them, dressing them, bathing them, just, taking care of them, like truly like hands on. That's different than domestic workers, which is more house cleaning and just cooking, and more of just like the housekeeper responsibilities versus like really like one-on-one, hand-to-hand taking care of a person. So if you're a personal attendant, then there's no rest breaks or meal breaks that you have to give, which is actually a really, really big deal, because, in the corporate world, if you don't give your employees a meal break in particular, it's a 30-minute meal break before the end of your fifth hour. That is, like I tell my clients, my corporate clients, that is a sacred 30 minutes, and you cannot mess around with it. And you can't give them a single job responsibility during that 30-minute lunch break. You also can't give them a single job responsibility during their 10-minute breaks, which they're entitled to after a certain amount of time in between their shift. The reason why they don't have this rule is because, let's just say your elderly mother is starting to fall down the stairs, and the employee's like, I'm on my break, sorry, I can't help you. I mean, that would be an absolute nightmare. So there's no way you can divorce yourself from the responsibilities that you have as a personal attendant. Now, the reality is that when you're a personal attendant, you're spending the vast majority of your time doing not a lot. Like you're sitting on the couch, there's a lot of TV watching. I mean, you don't have these active people that, active elderly people that are like require, it's not like babysitting children that you're running after. So there's a lot of breaks that are kind of built in. And I think that was kind of considered. That's my own philosophy just based on all the research and everything I've done, but I don't know that for sure, but it is true. The one thing you have to worry about is, okay, the biggest thing you have to worry about is overtime. So a lot of people, a lot of the clients that have come into my office and I'm defending, and I love when I have clients call me and they say, okay, I want to set up my parents for, we're about to hire caregivers. That is my favorite call. My least favorite call is we just got a claim from the labor commissioner, from a lawyer, and can you help us defend it? That's the worst call because I know how much this is going to cost them. It's not just my fees, it's what they're going to end up paying out, and it's tremendous. So when I get the let me just, let's work this out, that's great. Well, the ones where they're claims, what they're doing, a lot of people do, they have these very long shifts, like for obviously, not obviously, but many elderly people need 24-hour care. So you have it's the no good deed goes unpunished. That is the theme of this entire seminar, because most often the ones I've dealt with, these families, they are so good to their caregivers. They're being paid much more than minimum wage. They're living in beautiful homes. Oftentimes they have their own, if they're living there, sleeping there, they have their own beautiful bedroom. They have their own bathroom. They can, they have access to all the food. They're providing them food. Like it's a really nice, a nice plushy work experience when you're in that type of situation. The problem is that, let's just say you have one employee that's sleeping there. So you have a 24-hour employee. Well, if you don't have any of these agreements, which I'm about to talk about, in place, a caregiving agreement, a voluntary housing agreement, that employee is considered to be on call 24 hours in a day, which means you are required to pay them a regular rate, which is anything over minimum wage. You're only required to give minimum wage. You're not required to give a single penny above minimum wage, which right now, there's different cities have different numbers, but California minimum wage, I should have checked this out before I sat down here, but I think it's right about $15. So it goes up every January 1st in California and every July 1st for different cities. So and it's just getting higher and higher and higher. So all you're required is to give minimum wage. But what happens is, after 9 hours, which thanks to this domestic worker bill of rights, you only have to do overtime after 9 hours, but you're only getting an hour reprieve, because in the real world, in corporate world, it's after 8 hours. So okay, so we have that. Thank goodness we get that one extra hour. So after 9 hours, you're required to give time and a half. And now in corporate world, it goes 12 hours, then you go to double time. In our personal attendant world, you don't have to do that. So it's always 1.5 times. But you're literally calculating 24 hours. After 9 hours, you get regular rate. From hour 9 through 24, you're at time and a half. That adds up so fast. And then if you're not doing it that way, which nobody does, it's exorbitantly expensive, then now you're in front of the labor board and you're dealing with an audit or whatever the case may be. And now you're on the hook, not only for all of that the missed rate, the missed overtime rate that you're on the hook for. There's, again, these penalties, and there's waiting time penalties, and there's other interests that apply, and I mean, that's when you get into the six figures, and it's horrible. And and if that caregiver has a really good lawyer, they will fight and fight and fight to get that money. And the truth is, they're owed it. They are absolutely owed it. So the reason why you don't want to do that is because of what I just explained. But there are like a little bit ways around this. So if you only want, and I do not suggest having one person, I think that's really dangerous, unless you're very clear in the caregiver agreement that your hours, you come here at 8 a.m. when, we'll call her Jane Smith. Jane Smith, my elderly mother. When my elderly mother wakes up around 9 a.m. and I need you, or 8 a.m., whatever I said, 8 a.m. and I need her there at 8. I need the caregiver there at 8 o'clock in the morning. Your shift starts at 8 a.m. Your shift ends at 5 p.m. And that's when my mother goes to sleep. So your shift is 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. And you put into that caregiver agreement, anything that happens between 5 p.m. and 8 a.m., you are off the clock. You want to leave, leave. You want to, you are welcome to sleep here. You don't have to sleep here. It's within your discretion. Now, obviously, it's complicated, because if, God forbid, my mother wakes up at midnight and is screaming, or falls off the bed, or can't get into the bathroom, or things that happen with the elderly population, the last thing you want is for your caregiver to call you and say, so your mom just fell, but I'm off the clock. There's nothing I can do. So if there's any chance that that's a possibility, which it probably is, then to protect yourself, you don't want to do that. But now saying this, I'm on the record because this is being recorded, but I'm kind of saying this off the record, is that um, as long as you know that your elderly parent, or and I keep saying parent, it could be your aunt, your uncle, I'm just doing this for simplicity. So let's just say your elderly parent. If you know that your elderly parent most likely is okay, that he or she is really sleeping through the night, they're not going to need that constant attention, then you're probably okay to do that. Even if you're not okay, and there's a few incidents where they have to run upstairs or run down the hall to go help your parent, that's not going to be that's something I can argue, because then I can go in front of the labor board and be like, look, this is a seemingly strong individual. She's elderly and needs care during the day, but at night she's really okay. There were a couple times where the caregiver was called to help, but for the most part she was okay. That's something that the labor board will be like, okay, so clearly every night you're not on call. It's just every once in a while. That it's not the best thing to do, because the ideal situation is that you're never ever required to be woken up in the middle of the night to help. But off the record, if you just know, like, you get what I'm saying. So you just want to have this all spelled out. So the caregiver agreement should have your times of when the shifts are on and off. The other thing you have to put in there, or that you should create, it's called a voluntary housing agreement. And what it says is that we are providing, because so often I get these calls and they're like, well, wait a minute, my caregiver, she doesn't have to stay here. We're happy to have her go home. We don't need her in the middle of the night. It's fine. But the problem is that they live, that caregiver lives 50 miles away. It's so much more convenient if she can stay here. She wants to stay here. So if you just say, okay, great, you have a handshake deal. Well, I can almost assure you that, I mean, I see the worst. I see when people are sued, when they're yelling at each other. I see like the worst of the worst. So often it's a beautiful story. Caregiver comes in, they're treated like family, everything is wonderful. The parents pass away, the caregiver still comes to the grandchildren's birthday parties. That's probably, hopefully, I pray that's the majority of the cases. I don't see that. Nobody calls a lawyer to be like, this is amazing, everything is beautiful. That's not when I get called in. So I see the worst of the worst. So when I'm advising, I'm always advising on, like, this is the worst case scenario. This is what could happen. But obviously that's why you hire a lawyer, right? To deal with the worst case scenario. So if you have this voluntary housing agreement, so let's say that all of a sudden your parents, either are now going into a medical facility because they need 24-hour medical care, or they just, they, whatever the case, they pass away. I mean, something happens where you no longer need that caregiver. Well, they're living in your home, in your parents' home, and now you have to, like, actually do like evictions to get them out if they're not willing to go. So if you have this voluntary housing agreement, it says you are voluntarily living here. This is not part of your job. This is not a requirement. It's not mandatory. This is a voluntary agreement. This agreement only lasts upon the duration of your employment with Jane and John Smith. Upon the death or termination of the employment with Jane and John Smith, you are no longer allowed to live here. And it says it in much more complicated legal terms, but that's literally all it says. And that is going to be extraordinarily helpful to you to get, because I have heard horror stories of where people are just like, I'm not leaving, this, and your parents promised me the house. I've gotten that story. And now what, now, and they spend every second with the elderly, your parents, and they are spending more time with them, obviously, than you are. So they get into these agreements. So to have all of this in writing is going to save you in the end. So it's really, really important. It's not just the caregiving agreement and the voluntary housing agreement that you need to have. There is a onslaught of onboarding documents that every one of my clients, corporate clients and my caregiving clients, they all have to have. And this is just a requirement in the state of California. So here's how I want you to think about this, because this is the way it is. Your elderly parents are literally the employers, and the caregivers are their employees. So if your parents have never ever been business owners, well, you know what, now they are. That's exactly what this is. So you have to create a payroll system. You have to be paying them through a payroll company, because all of the taxes, withholdings, all of that has to come out. And every single client I've ever had that calls me, either the ones that have gotten into trouble or ones that have been like just starting out but just want to make sure that they're doing it right, none of them go through payroll, because they don't even think about it. They're like, what are you talking about? We just write them a check. don't write them a check unless you're a CPA, which actually one of my clients is a CPA and he's like, I know how to do this and he's doing it. I checked everything. I'm like, you're amazing. That's not the norm. But if you're this brilliant CPA and you have the time to sit there and figure out taxes withholdings, fabulous. But like you need to be paying into unemployment. You need to be paying into all these different, all of the social security, all of the things that any employer has to pay into. You are now, you, elderly couple, elderly family, individual, whatever you are an employer and now you run a company. And so you have to have workers' comp insurance. If somebody gets injured, which trust me, grabbing somebody's arm and hurting your own, the caregiver hurting their back happens all the time. An elderly person accidentally, falling down a stair and then taking the caregiver with them, it happens. Not, I haven't dealt with that all the time, but I've certainly experienced that. I've seen it, and it's really really scary. And these caregivers, oftentimes they're here illegally, or they don't have a lot of money, and I mean, this is their skill set. They are caregivers, and that something like that happens, they may never be able to work again. You don't have insurance, they're going to come after you. They have nothing to lose at that point. So insurance is hugely important. A really good, I'm very clear. I'm not trying to sell anything. I'm not trying to sell myself. I'm not trying to sell any services, but I do have a tremendous amount of resources, just having my own practice for 6 years and working with companies. So, if you need any of these resources, I'm more than happy to share. But insurance is critical. The other thing you want to think about is timekeeping. So timekeeping is it's very very important. Where they are just all you have to worry about is clocking in and clocking out. Because let me tell you, quick employment 101 overview is that in California, all of the laws, and I think pretty much every single law in California that's related to employment is geared heavily towards protecting the employer. I'm sorry, the employee. Yeah, I wish the employee. It's all about the employees because the employers they're looked at as these wealthy, highly resourced individuals or entities that have all it doesn't affect them, right? It's like it's just cost of doing business. That's the whole policy. It's cost of doing business. And the poor victim employee who has nothing and they're being taken advantage of by the employer, so that everything is geared towards making sure that that employee is heavily protected. So I will tell you for a fact, because I deal with this every single day, is that when you're in front of a judge, in front of the labor commissioner, in front of anyone who has any authority, a mediator, an arbitrator to decide a matter, and you say, Judge, this employee comes in from 9 to 2. That's all we need them to come in, 9 to 2. And after that, we have other resources, whatever. I come in, I take care of my parents after 2 o'clock, 9 to 2. And that employee is like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I am there 24 hours a day. I sleep there every single night. They are using me all day long. I don't sleep. They don't feed me. They could say anything. Employees come up with the most creative, crazy, crazy stories. And if the employer has nothing to go on, they have no documentation to refute that. It's your word against their word. And guess what? California, that employee's word carries so much more weight than the employer. So the documentation is, in real estate, all they talk about is location, location, location. All I say is documentation, document, document, document. That's what I say all day long. I want to tattoo that on my forehead because it's so important. If you have documentation, you will be protected. Because if one of your caregivers, and this I help out a lot when all of a sudden caregiver kind of goes, something happens, they're either not available anymore, they're not accountable, your parents don't like them anymore, they haven't, their attitude has changed, whatever. I mean, people are people, right? It doesn't matter if they're caregivers or just employees, they're people and things happen, life happens. Well, you want to terminate, you want to terminate an employee that you have not been doing proper timekeeping, they're not on payroll, they own you. It's terrifying. I mean, you're basically held hostage. So whenever that happens, I'm like, okay, let's rewind and let's do this in compliance so that they don't, you're not being held hostage, and we could get out of this employment without you having this fear of them coming after you. So you want to make sure that you're doing proper timekeeping. I mean, and I have these huge corporate clients with 100, 200 employees, and they're not doing it right. So how are you expected to do it right when you don't? You're just trying to. All you're trying to do is care for your elderly family. It's horrible that you have to deal with this, but you do. So a sheet, like a paper sheet, it could be anything. It doesn't have to be anything sophisticated. That will be sufficient. Clock in, clock out, done. The date also. A really good tip that I'll tell you that I tell all my clients is at the bottom of your timesheet, put in there, I've received all of my wages for this time period. And there's been no overtime or something, then whatever is relevant to your situation, if they sign off on that and then they come back after you, that is like gold. I've defended many cases just with that line on the bottom. There's a lot of apps. I really need to learn them because I always say this, but I'm always like, but I don't know what they are, but I need to figure out what they are so I can advise. But there's so many apps out there for timekeeping, but it's so important. So you want to make sure that you're doing timekeeping, that you understand what overtime is. That's 1.5 after 9 hours, after the ninth hour. And you definitely want to be really diligent with your documentation. Okay. So even though you're not required to give these 30-minute meal breaks and these 10-minute rest breaks, you obviously don't want to starve your caregivers and you want to make sure that they are getting access to food. There are credits. I don't, most of my clients don't ever want to do this. I'm not exactly sure why. I can't understand it, but because why not? But you are able to legally deduct meal and lodging credits from your paychecks if you're providing them food and lodging. There's very specific amounts, and it changes every year. It goes up every year just with inflation and cost of living. But I can provide that to you if you want to send me an email. I'm happy to send you it's again, this is not rocket science. It's you can literally Google meal and lodging credits California, make sure it's California, look at the year, it'll tell you exactly what you could deduct. There's a breakfast amount, a lunch amount, and a dinner amount, and then there's lodging amounts. So if you're providing lodging to your caregivers and if you're providing meals, why not take some money out? It's expensive. But if you're afraid to upset the employee, that's understandable. I think that's probably why they don't do it. But you actually are within your rights to do that. Um, so so one of to get a little bit depressing again, the problem is that when in order to live in your home, like I said earlier, it truly is a luxury. Only true, I mean, to be perfectly candid, like only wealthy people can really do this because it is expensive. And so, like I said, with the having one employee 24 hours, I don't recommend. It's so much better to have staggered shifts. Ideally, if you really need somebody 24 hours, have three people, 8 hour increments. I think that's probably the easiest way to do it, even though now you have three bodies on payroll, but it does make more sense to do that. But the problem is that you have these elderly people, and I get so many calls where they're like, no, no, no. Our caregiver, we call her auntie. She is, she's like, she babysits on the weekends for my children. She's, she is truly part of our family. She would never, ever, she would never come after our family. But, they're sitting in a home and they see what you have and they see the cars that you drive and they see the jewelry that's in the house and they see the lifestyle that these people are living and it's a nice lifestyle and typically a caregiver is making maybe $20 an hour, maybe $30 an hour, but these are not wealthy people that are living in like big nice beautiful homes driving really nice cars. That's not the typical caregiver that I've handled, that I've dealt with. So sorry, there's major sirens behind me. So in that, when they're seeing that, all their loyalty and their love for the family, the second that family member either passes away or then moves on, first of all, they've probably been living, as I said, it's a good job. Most of them, they're not always great, but the ones that I've dealt with are really, really good jobs. They're loving families. They're getting really good food. They're living in beautiful homes. It's not a lot of, work because they're spending a lot of their time just watching television with their clients on a day-to-day basis, and all of a sudden that job ends. And now you don't have them on payroll, so they're not allowed to get unemployment if they, and that's where a lot of these issues come up, is that even if you don't have the angry caregiver that wants to come after you now that they don't have a job anymore, they'll file for unemployment because why wouldn't they? They have no idea that they're not eligible for it. But if you haven't been paying into unemployment, there's nothing to go for. Like they're not going to get unemployment from an entity that doesn't really exist, that there hasn't been unemployment money paid towards it in their paychecks. So then all of a sudden the EDD is like, whoa, here's somebody applying for unemployment. Let's see what's going on. And now they have this great opportunity to go after a wealthy individual for not paying unemployment. And that goes into the whatever the pot is of what they're going to end up ultimately owing. So, and then the IRS could come after you because you haven't been properly paying taxes. It's just endless. So even if the caregiver is not coming after you themselves, you're still going to be in this world of hurt if you haven't been doing it properly, if the employee goes after you for unemployment. Similarly, if an employee gets injured, and you're not paying, you don't have workers' comp insurance, well, of course they're going to go file a workers' comp claim, or they're going to go get a workers' comp lawyers. There's billboards off of every freeway. Have you been injured at work? Call this number. And like, whoa, I'm injured. I'm going to call this number. Well, you don't have workers' comp insurance. Now, I'm going to say this because it's the truth, but it never, ever, ever happens. But not having workers' comp insurance is actually a criminal violation. It's not just civil. So I say that because it's the truth, but I've never, ever, ever seen anybody go to jail for not having workers' comp insurance. But it's a very serious thing not to have workers' comp. So that's why it's so important to have to have this all done in compliance. But the point is about the big, beautiful house. So the two big cases that have just traumatized me, which is where all my passion comes from, is that initial case that I told you about with the Filipino family, the Filipino caregivers, and that beautiful family. And it was horrifying to see the amount of money that they ended up having to pay out. But it was also this other family. And so this was an aunt. The aunt was a very elderly aunt who was living in the city of LA, in West LA, and she had caregivers, and it was exactly the situation. They're like, this family, it wasn't, they weren't Filipino, but it was also a family unit where it was like this one woman was the main caregiver, and then her sister was involved in it. Her elderly mother was also caregiving. She was very healthy and strong and active. She was doing some of the caregiving. It was a whole family, and they were tag teaming it, and they were making so much money, and they were living in this huge, gorgeous house in West LA, gorgeous house. And they know that they have money. Well, when the family passed away, they came after this family in full force. The aunt never had her own children, so the niece and the nephew were super, super close to them. And the niece and the nephew, I think they were like in their late 60s, early 70s. I mean, this is not a young couple. And I'll never forget in my conference room seeing this. We did a mediation in my conference room, and I had the entire caregiving family in my office, and I had the attorney who was very nasty, and they often are. I don't know why. I'm sure there's some sweet ones out there. I just have not experienced them. And it was me, and it was my client, and it was my client, the niece and the nephew through marriage, the nephew-in-law, and they're sitting next to me, and then the niece, who's like 70 years old, is sitting there crying because she lost her aunt. She was super close to her aunt. And then it devolved into like a Jerry Springer show, which now I feel bad since he just recently passed away. But it was the family. They were screaming at my client. They were saying, how dare you? How dare you tell us that we're not entitled to your aunt's money? When did you visit? And the aunt is like bawling, and he's like, we visited once a week. We went there on weekends. We went there as much as we could. We both work. And no, you didn't even love them. And it's like you're dealing with the loss of somebody that you cared about so much. And then to have this element of it, it was horrible. Like it took everything I had to just try to emotionally detach myself, because I almost started crying listening to this and watching my client cry. It was devastating. So and when I talk to them, I'm like, really, like I can't even picture them being like good people. They're like, you have no idea. They have babysat, our children. Like it was so awful. It was so awful. So my goal is for nobody to ever have to deal with that ever again. Like it's just an awful experience. So just know, and I hate to say this because I have nothing but love and faith for humanity. I truly love people, and I think everyone really is fundamentally good, but it's hard to feel that way sometimes when you see the things that I've seen. So just be aware that no matter how beautiful and wonderful, your family's caregivers are, be protecting yourself, because they will come after you. It's very stressful. And in their defense, all of a sudden they've lost all of their income, they've lost everything, and they don't know where they're going to go. And it's, unlikely they're just going to go walk right into another job like that. So it's it's desperate. They're just desperate. So having said that, that's why you need to really, really be diligent and compliant. So then the question is, you're listening to all of this, you're like, this is craziness. Like I work full time. The last thing I want is to now have a second job of making sure that my parents' caregivers are being taken care of in a compliant way. This is madness. And I don't disagree with you. It is madness. It's a lot of work. So then the question becomes, do we go to an agency? And I get this question all the time. And to be honest with you, I would say yes. I think it's so much easier to go through an agency. I would so much rather not take somebody's money and say, you know what, don't pay me and go through all that aggravation. Go to an agency. Let them deal with the headache. But because nothing is ever easy, here's the caveat. The caveat is that agencies, that's not the end all be all. Because what happens is in the law, there's this construct, this legal construct called joint employment. And so when you have an agency as your family's, middleman, they're employing that individual, right? So they're doing the payroll. They're the ones carrying the insurance. They're the ones that are timekeeping. They're the ones that are monitoring overtime. They're the ones doing everything, right? But let's say there's now a lawsuit, because lawsuits happen. Then they will, I can assure you, that the caregiver, when they have their lawyer, they hire their lawyer is going to file a complaint either with the labor commissioner or the civil court, and they're going to name the agency and they're going to name the elderly couple as joint employers. So you don't just get out of this. This is for staffing agencies. This is for any type of agency. It is a buffer. Now, if the agency is doing it properly, then I feel very good about that, because you know what? That's great. They're taking care of it. They're going to be able to defend this lawsuit. They have their own lawyer. Whether or not they're going to indemnify you, probably not. I've actually spoken to some of my agency clients. I'm like, why don't you just put in? I go, if you just throw in an indemnification clause, like I feel like we'll be good to go. I can throw your name out to everybody I know. Well, the reason they don't do it, and I understand it. It's just frustrating. The reason they don't want to do an indemnification clause is because they lose control of that employee once they're in that home. Well, what if they're doing things that are terrible? What if they're asking them to do things that are outside the realm of what they're supposed to do as an employee? So they don't want to take that on. So it's like it's a equal trust. And so they're not trusting of the families necessarily, that they know what they're doing. The family doesn't necessarily trust the agency. So now you're in this like really bad situation where you're really kind of just like vulnerable and hoping that the agency is doing it properly. Now, I do have a few agency clients that I can absolutely vouch for because I've done audits for them. I know how they're running their business. I know they're taking care of their employees, and I feel very safe with that. But the other agencies, are maybe plenty of agencies are doing it wonderfully. I don't know, but I just wouldn't vouch for them because I don't know. But what I will tell you is that the reason why so many people don't use agency is because they're incurring the cost of insurance, incurring the potential cost of legal fees, which is obviously very expensive, because they're dealing with, vetting the employees. Those are their employees, and they can have hundreds of employees depending on the size of the agency. That's a big payroll ticket every 2 weeks. Well, it's expensive. They're obviously like they're putting the cost back onto the consumer. That's what businesses do, and they're padding it because they want to make some sort of profit. 'Cause otherwise, why doing why have the company? It's obviously are in a company to make a profit, so it can be exorbitantly expensive. Now, I had a client that came, I think, through my last year's presentation. They called me and they're like, okay, we want to hire you. So I met with them for a couple hours, and wonderful, beautiful family, and I met the parents who are amazing. And when I started going through everything they need to do, they're like, this is nuts. And they have a lot of money. They have a tremendous amount of money in their family. So they were able, I said, you know what? Let me give you the number of an agency. You vet them. If you don't like them, I will come back. I will make sure that you're set up. I'll take care of you. But if you like this agency, it's really in your best interest just to go with the agency. And they did, and they love the agency. And as far as I know, the last time I spoke to them, they're very, very happy. So if you have the money, I do think it's definitely the better solution, because it just will save you a tremendous amount of headaches. But you also lose a little bit of control because they're vetting the caregivers as opposed to you. But obviously, if you're working with a good agency, they'll make sure that you're taken care of. I mean, you're paying a nice premium to make sure that you're happy. So that's how I feel about agencies. If you have the right one, great. If you don't, you're gonna be in a world of hurt. Um, and the other thing I want to tell you is that if you're going to vet your own agency, there's a lot of agencies out there that are franchised. They're based in Florida, they're based in North Carolina, Texas, whatever the case is. I mean, most people don't want to be headquartered in California for obvious reasons. And so they're in other states. Well, a lot of these agencies, if they're not savvy, which in fairness, most companies, they don't know this stuff, but the laws apply wherever the state in which the work is being done. So even though you're franchised in even though you're headquartered in Florida, where the laws are very, very lenient for employers, which is why it's beautiful to run a business in Florida, then now you're have employees in California. Florida law does not apply in any way in terms of employment. For business things, maybe it does, not for employment law. So all of the laws are going to apply in California, and you have no idea how many agencies, when they call me because they need their own advice and they learn that, they're like, oh, I didn't know that. And so you have to make sure that if you have a franchise agency, you have to ask them, are you, do you understand California law? Like, do you have, who are your resources in California? You really need to vet them. That's so critically important. So if you have the money, go agency, but make sure that that agency knows what they're doing. So that is pretty much my entire soapbox presentation. The only thing I'm going to do like a very quick summary. I think we're good on time, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions. But so what you need to do, this is my bullet points. You want to understand your legal obligations. I mean, I obviously gave you a very quick overview of employment law in 48 minutes, But there's, there's so much. I mean, I think if you really follow everything I said, you should actually be in pretty good shape. But if you're like, I don't really understand a lot of things that you said because you talk really, really fast, then I'm happy to break it down for you. And like Martha said, she does have a one sheet that I created. And truly, if you want to call me for questions, I will not charge you for questions here and there. If you need me to set you up, I'll charge you for that. And if you have a lawyer that you've been working with, please, if they understand this stuff, they're an employment lawyer. I'm not trying to step on anybody's toes. I'm truly here just to educate. I really, really don't want anybody to be in a situation where you're calling me because you just got sued, because that is, I hate dealing with that stuff. It's just, it's so emotionally taxing for me, and I just feel so bad. And so I will do everything to prevent that. So a written caregiver agreement, if you do nothing else, do that. Do a written caregiver agreement. It is so important just to have it spelled out. Okay, if you do nothing else, that plus make them a W-2 employee. Don't make them a 1099. I haven't even gotten into that. That's like literally another 1 hour seminar, which I will spare you. But bottom line is, I can assure you these are not 1099s. You don't want to make them 1099s ever. And a 1099 is a really great way for the EDD to open their books on you. It's the EDD who's married to the IRS, and those two entities together will make your life miserable. So 1099, never, ever, ever, ever the solution here. So never pay in cash, horrible idea. You want to pay in check, and you want to take out taxes, withholdings. You want to do it properly. It's so, so important. I keep saying I'm not going to throw out names of anything, so I don't want to sell anything, but I will tell you, just because this is, I don't care. I want you guys to know that a payroll company, a really, really good DIY payroll company that makes it really easy. Our law firm uses it. I'm not making any money off of this, I can assure you, but there is a company called Gusto. It's gusto.com, and they have incredible customer service. It's just a really easy way for a very small business with, just 1-2 employees can create a payroll service. And I also, there's tons of really great payroll companies out there, but that one is it's just DIY. But if you need like more hand holding, then, there's other companies that you may want to have some sort of more personalized service to hold your hand through it. And then just be proactive. That's one of my bullet points here. It's like so many, I have this one horror situation. I am not making this up. I had somebody call me, the nicest couple, and they said, okay, we have, we heard about you. We have these caregivers, for my wife's parents. We really think that we need your help. And I'm like, fantastic. I'm like, here's what I do. And I gave them my whole rundown in like 2 minutes. And I said, call me. So then they said, great, you're perfect for us. That's exactly what we need. We're going to call you. They called me 3 weeks later, right? Which is not that abnormal. Fine. It takes a while to like finally say, okay, we're going to hire that lawyer. So they called me 3 weeks later, and they said, you're not going to believe this. We were literally, it was like a Monday. They said, or it was a Tuesday. They said, we were going to call you yesterday and sign your engagement letter. We were ready to go. They got hit with a letter from the lawyer that it was a lawsuit. And it was the worst lawyer. I literally blocked his name. If he ever sends me another letter for another client, I'll remember it. But I blocked this guy's name. He was so sleazy. He could care less about my clients. He could care less about anything. All he wanted was, dollar signs. His client was so slimy. It was the worst situation, and it killed me. So we ended up settling that for a very large amount. It was very devastating. And had they hired me 3 weeks earlier, I'm telling you, they would not have been in that situation. So be proactive. Like, don't wait on it. Don't think like, well, I'll deal with this next week. Like, really start to get all of this in place. If you already have caregivers, if you're thinking about it, that's the perfect time to either call me. I mean, Martha is a wealth of knowledge and resources as well, but definitely you want to reach out to somebody. So that's my whole thing. Thank you so much for listening, Martha. I can't see anything here. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer anything.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. I feel like I'm starting to learn and retain all of this from hearing it from you. We do have a couple of questions, and this first one is a really good one that I don't know the answer to. And she says, I have many clients on Medi-Cal, and they use IHSS for their caregivers. Is Medi-Cal following all the employment law for these workers?
Well, I don't even know what IHSS is. What is that?
So it's in-home support services, and it's a program through our Medicaid services. So Medicaid health insurance is the low-income insurance that actually pays for home care for people that qualify. And so but my understanding is, and so my guess is you probably can't answer the question at this time, but that the way it works is that the older adult themselves, the Medicaid recipient, is considered like the employer because they sign the time cards and everything, but then the money gets paid directly to the caregiver from the county agency.
So I don't know the answer to that because I didn't even know what this was until 10 seconds ago. But I do know that if it's, I mean, I wouldn't just say, oh, well, it's government, so I'm sure it's fine. But I can tell you that if you're not the one, if yes, the elderly person is always the employer. That's just across the board. They are the employer. They're the ones that are employing the caregivers. But if it's being paid out by Medicare, the reason why I could see that there'd still be liability or exposure is if the elderly person is signing off on timesheets, if they're not doing it properly, or if the employee is going to say, well, okay, so if they're submitting the timesheets, the Medicare should know that or Medicaid, when they see the timesheets, if it's over 10 hours or whatever, they should know that it's an hour of 1.5. But I would just still want to double check it, but I don't know the rules. And that would be governed under federal law because that's a federal program. It's not California. And federal law is definitely it's definitely not as onerous as California. But I don't know. I honestly have not dealt with that. It's an excellent question. And I can certainly look into it and find out, but off the top of my head, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious because I've not heard of any issues in that way, but I do know that a certain responsibility does fall on the Medicaid recipient themselves because kind of like when you use an agency, you can't be sure what's happening when they're inside the home. So that would be interesting to learn more.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
And then uh, is a caregiver agreement needed if you go through an agency?
So yeah, I mean, yes, but then they're signing off. If an agency is doing it properly, they're going to have all those. I think it's ridiculous. It's like 15 to 17 documents for hiring an employee, and that's for any employee. If it's you're talking about a retail store, anything, any industry, then the agency doing it properly will have all those onboarding documents, and they a caregiving agreement. Caregiver agreement is just it's like a fancy customized offer letter. That's really what a caregiver agreement is. And it just spells out the terms of the employment. So a properly done agency, a proper compliant agency will have that, yes. But you as you as the person as a working with the agency, it is absolutely in your best interest to ask the agency to send you all that documentation, which they probably have, and you probably just like stored it away in a folder somewhere and didn't really necessarily look at it, or just glanced but didn't know what to look for. That's something that you either need to like spend a little bit more time with, or give it to me, I'll do it. Give it to your employment lawyer, whoever it is that you work with. Have somebody review all that to make sure it's done in compliance.
So that actually fits with our next question, which is, will employment lawyers vet agencies for a family for a fee? And how long would this take to do?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and I struggle with it because it kills me for you, the person hiring the agency, to have to pay a lawyer to do some sort of audit. It really should be the agency paying the lawyer to do the audit. So, but yeah, I mean, I do think that it's better. It's better to you can't force somebody to pay a lawyer to do the audit, right? To make sure that everything's done in compliance. And they may say, no, no, no. We work with a lawyer, we've done everything in compliance, and we can assure you we're not going to pay for another audit. But yes, it is in your best interest to pay 1 or 2 hours of a lawyer's time to make sure that they're doing it properly, than to risk being having some sort of horrible lawsuit where you're thrown into it and you're on the hook. The good news is, and I didn't really say this, but if there's a lawsuit and you're joint employers, and so the agency is brought in and you're brought in, and then there's some sort of settlement or verdict or whatever, it's going to be apportioned. So let's say it's $100,000. There's going to be some apportioned to you, family members. There's going to be some apportioned to the agency, and it just depends on how the judge wants to apportion and either the jury does or the judge based on instructions. But you're not going to be on the hook for all of it. You don't want to be on the hook for any of it. But yes, the answer is yes. Yes, you can pay an attorney to audit the agency's records to make sure they're being done in compliance.
So you wouldn't be auditing all their records. You would be
No,
reviewing what you bring.
so if somebody called me and said, okay, I'm working with this agency, now you freaked me out, I want to make sure it's done properly, then I would say to you, send me all the documentation that the agency gave you. If they didn't give you anything, I'd call the agency and I say, I'm working with this client and that you have to provide me these records. It's my client's records. They're entitled to it. Please send me all the documentation that you have for that employee, for that caregiver. And then I would,
Gotcha.
I didn't even touch on like, cars are a big deal because a lot of times, the family members have an old car and like, oh, here, the caregiver can just use that car. Well, you have to be checking making sure they have a valid driver's license. You have to make sure that they have car insurance. If something happens in that car while they're during working hours, it's called respondent superior. The employer is liable for that. So that's something to consider. And that's something that you need to make sure your insurance is covering, your auto insurance. So that's something that an agency needs to be vetting. Like they need to know, well, does that caregiver have their own car? And let's say they have their own car. So that's not the issue. Well, they're driving your elderly parents. Well, what if something happens? So how is that covered? So that all goes into the equation as well.
Okay. Wow. Wonderful. That's all the questions,
Oh,
unless somebody else has another question to add. When we came in just perfectly at the time. This was so incredibly helpful. I think my guess is it probably does feel a little overwhelming to people, but hopefully that just brings people into action so that they can be proactive. And when in doubt, call you or another labor attorney, really, and just check it out first. I think that's what's really important. And the one pager that you created has, some of the basic bullet points of your topic, and also has referrals. It has your contact information as well as a couple of other labor attorneys. So I will go ahead and send that out to everybody that registered, so they can always get in touch with you if needed.
yeah.
So thank you so, so much. I know what an impact this talk has on everybody.
I hope so. As I said, and I cannot be more sincere about this. I just want people to be educated. There's nothing better than having, some knowledge about this than just operating in the dark and just hoping for the best. Because, and like I said, I mean, there's so many situations that end in such a beautiful ending. It's like, it's the passing of your family and the caregivers at the funeral and everyone's grieving together and then they move on. And that's the ending that we all hope for. But when it goes south and then I just don't want anybody to be in that situation.
Absolutely. Hopefully these cases that you've seen are not the norm, but it doesn't mean that they couldn't happen to one of us. And so I think it's really important that we be prepared, educated, and proactive.
There you go.
Well, thank you so, so much for your time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'll send that email out with the information tomorrow. And I hope everybody, yes, just saying that she will continue to educate her clients. And because this is so expensive, it's a major reason why people do choose assisted living. When you start to need more than just a few hours a week of care, cost-wise, it really does make sense. Home care agencies now are, $38 an hour and higher, and even higher. So that's absolutely true. And I will follow up with you to see if you are able to gather any more information about in-home support services. So I do think that would be helpful for me to know as well.
Yeah, I can find out. I'm happy to do that.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, and hope you all have a wonderful evening.